Alrighty, so now we're back for part two, talking about types of pluralism. Cultural pluralism. It exists when groups have not acculturated and each remains its own identity. Uh, for example, it gives you the example of the Amish, a religious community sometimes called the Pennsylvania Dutch, are also a culturally pluralistic group. They are committed to a way of life organized around farming. They maintain a culture and an institutional life that is uh, separate from the dominant culture. Uh, so another group that we can talk about is culturally pluralistic. Certainly not for every tribe in the United States, but for some tribes, the reality has been, and even the social movement has been towards pluralism, cultural pluralism, because one of the main aspects of Native American social movement has been towards maintaining and increasing their cultural pluralism. That is to save their cultural differences. That's been a really mainstay of Native American life in the United States, is to remain distinct. Lose our culture and we lose who we are. So cultural pluralism is very important to Native Americans and other groups as well. Cultural pluralism for African Americans, because of their history with slavery and segregation, has not been as strong because, after all, the civil rights movement was a movement towards inclusion. So really, a major part in voting rights, and so one of the major pushes, of course, is in the African American community has been towards assimilation. We want to have an equal footing. We like to assimilate into American society and take part at all levels in American society. And so we can see those two play out. Cultural pluralism is not has not been, though there's been movements such in the Black Power movement and others, but the main thrust has been towards to assimilate, whereas for Native Americans it's been towards cultural pluralism. So that's on one level. Cultural pluralism is when the group tries to remain distinct culturally. Second aspect of pluralism is structural pluralism. Cultural differences are minimal, but the group occupied different locations in the social structure. So let me give you the best example of this. Cultural differences from the minority group and the dominant group are minimal. That is, there's not a lot of cultural pluralism there. But there's structural pluralism. That is, one group is not well represented in the structures of society, and one of the best examples would be to look at the occupational scale. And so African Americans, for example, we talk about structural pluralism as having been a very big historical reality for African Americans, whereas the cultural distinction was not that great because of the emphasis on assimilation by African Americans because of their struggles to be included in American culture, society. However, there is structural pluralism. That is, even though it's better today than it was in the past, African Americans were not well distributed along the occupational scale. So that we didn't, historically African Americans were predominantly seen at the lower end of the occupational scales: field workers, domestic workers, and later industrial jobs, and certain types of low service positions. But certainly over time, and with the ongoing successes in the African American movement, social movement, such as the civil rights movement, and there's been an increase, very much so an increase. Till today, we have an African American president. So, and that's just one sign that African Americans have been able to overcome some of their structural pluralism. But still, we still find areas in the occupational scale where we don't find as many African Americans as we should at this point in time, and we'll be seeing more of this. So cultural pluralism and structural pluralism. You also have structural assimilation and cultural assimilation. So make sure you can distinguish those. Here's another On the same page, the 52, we talk about enclave minority group, middleman minority groups. This kind of goes against the grain to some extent of Milton's stage-like fashion assimilation theory. An enclave minority group establishes its own neighborhood and relies on a set of interconnected businesses, each of which is small in scope and for its economic survival. Some of these businesses serve the group, whereas others serve the larger community. So there are several examples in the country of enclave minority groups. One, the book cites the Cuban American community in South Florida, and the Chinatowns in many larger American cities are examples of ethnic enclaves. They have their own communities, their own businesses are run. A lot of times they're family owned, and so it's kind of a structural assimilation, but their cultural assimilation may not be that strong because they're insulated in terms of their lifestyle. The middleman minority group also relies on small shops and retail firms, but the businesses are more dispersed through a large area rather than concentrated in a specific locale. Some Chinese American communities fit the second pattern, as do Korean American grocery stores. Arab American markets, Indian American owned motels. These types of minority groups are discussed further in Part 3. But the economic success of the enclave middleman minorities is partly due to the strong ties of cooperation and mutual aid within the group itself. We see this also to some extent with Mexican Americans as well. The ties are based in internal cultural bonds that would weaken if acculturation took place. So in contrast to Gordon's idea that acculturation is a prerequisite to integration, whatever success these groups enjoy is due in part to the fact that they have not Americanized. So by keeping their communities, their families tightly knit, and bonded, continuing with their language and their cultural practices, they've become structurally assimilated to some extent. They've become structurally or occupationally, business-wise. They've become successful economically while remaining culturally distinct to a great degree. So this complicates Gordon's theory tremendously. And then the chapter goes on into the history of from immigrants to white ethnics. From immigrants to white ethnics. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and let you read these sections. It talks about European origins, conditions of entry into the United States. And it talks about various immigrants from Norway, from Germany, looking at some of their assimilation patterns. They look at immigrant laborers from Ireland and Southern Eastern Europe. Generally, the immigrants from second wave, we call it, from Ireland, Southern, and Eastern Europe tended to be discriminated against, much more so. The Irish were extremely discriminated against as they immigrated to the United States. It was still seen as a voluntary minority group status, but when they got here, they did experience a lot of the same stereotypes and images that were utilized in a racist fashion against African Americans were turned around and used against Irish Americans. They were not thought as white people. Many students do not know this history so well, but certain of your, especially the second wave of the Irish and the Eastern, Southern European immigrants were discriminated against. Some of these groups were not even considered to be white when they first entered into the United States. I have a historical book. It's called Working Toward Whiteness, and it's all about these immigrant groups and how they had to work over long periods of time, sometimes ironically and unfortunately having to discriminate against the racialized involuntary minority groups in order to gain entry into the quote unquote to be accepted into white society, if you will, of their time. So groups, Jewish Americans were not thought of as white when they first immigrated to the United States. Italian Americans were not considered to be white when they entered the United States, and they had to work for a long time in order to overcome this racialized barrier. So even some of what we've considered the European immigrants that were voluntary groups, there were attempts to racialize them as there was a lot of stereotypes, a lot of caricatures, racist caricatures made, especially the Irish. The Irish received the worst butt end of this discrimination. So Italian Americans, but also the Irish were not. Again, you would think that Irish is being so representative of white America, if you will, were not considered white when they immigrated, and had to work a long time, had to lose a lot of cultural differences, but then because of the racial similarity, actually, the visual part of it in terms of skin color and whatnot, after they lost their cultural distinctions, they began to increasingly assimilate. As other immigrant groups came behind them, they began to fill up the lowest ends of jobs. The Irish began to assimilate upward till, after so long, you begin to have Irish mayors and Irish, the whole stereotype of the Irish cops, and they begin to assimilate occupationally into mainstream society and merge into the white community, if you will. Same thing with Italian Americans. It was a struggle over time. Okay, so it goes on into some of these issues. Just looking at it historically. Just going to make sure I finish up doing what I need to do here. Pattern of assimilation and the importance of generations. And it talks in here about the importance of the notion of the first generation, second, third generation immigrants, how that gets played out. And I've seen this firsthand. Well, I didn't see all of it, but I know of it firsthand because my wife Madeline is a French citizen, and her family immigrated. Her father was a long story. I won't go into his story, but it's been some of his experiences he's been written about in a couple of history books. But her father was pretty well known in his part of France, known as taking part in the French underground against Nazi Germany, and he saved a lot of lives on his farm, and he saved also he saved German soldiers who were running from the German army. He saved Jews. He saved, but quite a bit of American forces, and so one of those people he saved was from Michigan, and so he promised my stepfather that who passed away in the early 1960s. He was killed by a drunk driver after surviving all the close calls he had with the Nazis. But anyway, they stayed in the United States, my wife and her children, her siblings and her mother and her older sister and brother-in-law. They opened a French bakery in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and still running today. And so the family was able to survive some insulation through the business, and became quite successful. And but I saw this generation. My wife saw this generational change. When they first came there, they were made fun of in school because they couldn't speak English, and they wore clothing was a little different. But certainly that language barrier. But over time, they learned English and were able then to meld into the school system. Became more accepted, but then herself, not so much herself, but her nephew, and he would bring his friends over even in high school. He didn't want his mother to talk about. He didn't want to feed them French foods. He didn't want his friends to know about his mom speaking and father speaking French. He would ask them not to do that. And he kind of really disidentified with being French because he wanted to be Americanized. He wanted to be accepted as an American. And so over time, the culture, they quite successfully have have assimilated. Certainly they recognize their French roots and still speak French. But if you were to meet my wife, she would think she would say she's from Michigan. And she has a Michigan accent, though she speaks perfect French. And has the accent, too, goes along with it when she speaks French. But you wouldn't know it by meeting her. So read about the importance of generations, ethnic succession. Then he gets finally into looking at the politics. The Irish tended to follow the Northern and Western Europeans in the job market and social class structure. And it talks about the Irish and some of the other groups, and talks about the development of the labor unions and the role played by various groups such as the Irish, and how they partook in industrializing America and the labor union efforts. And over on Narrative Portrait, a really good reading for you is The Ethnicity, Prejudice, and the Irish Political Machine, Shadow of the Past. Read that reading. He goes on to talk about religion and other pathways, continuing industrialization and structural mobility for many of the European immigrant groups, religion. So it looks at religion, social class, gender, and again, I'm not focusing. Talks about the evolution of white ethnicity, page 79. And again, it talks about some of the, unfortunately, that many of the white ethnic working class saw racial minority groups as inferior and perceived the advantages being made by these groups as unfair and unjust and threatening to their livelihood. And so there was a lot of racism and prejudice between the emerging white ethnic groups, in competition with the racialized involuntary minority groups. Read about that. It talks about the twilight of white ethnicity, talking about how some folks have lost. It's become more ephemeral. The notion of a white ethnicity. Are we losing the notion of whiteness altogether? And as we're becoming less and less dominated by the white ethnic groups as we go towards the mid-century. And then we've got so a lot of the narrative here, as you notice, is looking at assimilation and pluralism, and looking at it historically, giving you a lot of historical information. Our current debate on this chapter is English only, so you guys go ahead and finish that debate up, and I'll be reading those. But just to finish up by saying just briefly that when it comes to exam time, unless I specify that certain historical information is going to be on the exam, I'm not testing you over the historical details, not at this time. When we start moving towards the final exam, we start looking at from chapter 6 onward, then the historical timeline, I call them. And that's what we'll be dealing with, will be the historical timeline for the case studies that we'll be addressing. And so the nature of some of the exams then will become based on some of the great historical markers and some of the players in various aspects. For example, African Americans, the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power movement. We'll look at the emergence of the middle class in African American community. So these timelines will become, historical timelines will be the blunt of your main focus of your exams from there on. These first two exams are still going to be focused mainly on the concepts and theories, and that's what's going to be on your exam, is mainly testing you on these concepts and these theories, and not the dates and times and the actual historical information that you're reading. That material is there to illustrate the theoretical concept or model that Healy's trying to build. From chapter 1 to chapter 5, Healy's trying to give you and to help you understand that he's building a model, theoretical model, to understand social inequalities among groups, both racially, economically, so by race, class, and gender, or by race, ethnicity, class, and gender is his focus. And the theoretical model that he's building over the first 5 chapters will be utilized in the last, from chapter 6 onward, to illustrate, to use these in a comparative fashion so we can make these nice comparative summations about where groups are today and how their position in society today reflects their past historical experiences and positions. So focus on these concepts I just went over. Look at the definitions, think about the examples, separate them, know the difference between cultural and structural assimilation, know the difference between cultural and structural pluralism, for example, know the difference between Parks. Parks is a theory, a race relations cycle, and then look at Milton Gordon's theory, the difference between melting pot and Anglo-conformity. These kinds of areas is where your test is going to be made up of. So you're going to want to focus on those and study those well. And I'll be giving you as we finish up next week with the next chapter and we have our first exam, I'm going to give you an extensive test review online. And I'll have some, also even on the discussion board, I'll have some information there for you as well. So just the main point now is to get these chapters read, get your writing work, get your discussions done with the reader, and start studying, then going back and start studying these concepts, if you will, these small models, theoretical models. Make sure that's what you need to really touch base with for your next exam and for all the exams until we get to chapter 6. So there's two basic exams on the theoretical chapters of 1 through 5. Then the rest is applying those theories to these case studies in their timeline, historical timeline. All right. So if you have any questions, just shoot me an email, and I'll be seeing you online. Have a good day.